All right, in this video, we're going to be talking about multiplication patterns, specifically powers of 10. So powers of 10 would be when we're looking at simply numbers like multiples of 10, 10, 100, 1,000, because we write them as 10 to the first is 10, and 10 to the second power, or 10 squared, would be 100, and 10 cubed is 1,000. So those are our powers of 10. So let's look at an example right now. So Pet Paws is ordering more goldfish to sell at their store. Each goldfish costs $2. Use the table to determine the cost of 10, 100, and 1,000 goldfish. Describe this pattern in the number of zeros when multiplying the cost, $2, by each power of 10. So we know that each one of these goldfish is going to be $2. So one goldfish is going to be $2 because we did not have any powers of 10. So, I mean, it's like 10 to the 0, in which 10 to the 0 would be like saying 1. So it's like saying, well, 2 times 10 to the 0 power. Well, if I'm saying that 10 to the 0 power is 1, well, that's like saying, well, 2 times 1. And that's why we get 2. But now, if we're looking at if we bought 10 goldfish, well, I've got 10 or 2 times 10, so it's going to be 20. So if I'm looking at the number of zeros in our product, that's like looking at this and saying, well, how many zeros do I have here? Well, I have 1 0. That's why we see 10 to the first power. And then if I'm looking at this and saying, well, 2 times 100, well, that'd be 200. How many zeros do I have? Well, I see 1, I see 2 zeros, so I have 2 zeros in my product. And lastly, 2 times 1,000, well, that'd be 2,000. How many zeros do we see? Well, I see 1, 2, and 3 zeros, so I have 3 zeros in my product. Oh, let's backtrack here. If I have 100, that'd be like saying 10 squared. And if I had 10 cubed, I have 1,000. Well, if I look at this, look at the connection that we have with our numbers. If I have 10 to the first, how many zeros did I have? Well, I had 1 0 here. If I have 10 squared, right, the 2, I have 2 zeros in my answer. And if I have 10 cubed, well, I have 3 zeros, right? So the number of zeros in the product increases when the power of 10 increases. Each successive, now that means each one that follows, each power of 10 adds 1 0 to the product. So how many zeros are in the product of 7 and 100? Well, if I look at multiplying 7 times 100, well, I would end up with 700. So how many zeros will we have? 2, because I see that I have, let's bring that down just a notch, I have 1, 2 zeros in 100. If I have 21, well, how many zeros do I have in 10? I've got 1. So my answer, I'll only have 1 0, which that actually would then be 210. And if I had 12 times 1,000, well, I've got 1, 2, 3 zeros here. So my answer, I should have 3 zeros, which would end up being 12,000, because 12 times 1,000 would be 12,000. So let's look at a few more examples. Now, find 13 times 10 squared mentally. Well, that doesn't mean that we need to be totally, lazy mathematician, not doing any work at all, showing anything. But we should be able to look at this and see a pattern. Well, 10 squared. Well, 10 squared would have how many zeros? Well, it's going to have 2 zeros. So my answer is going to be 13 times, well, 10 squared is 100, right? So if I count the number of zeros in the power of 10, I've got 2 zeros. I'm going to compare that number to the number of zeros in our exponent, 10 squared, right? Well, how many zeros do we have? We have 2, so they are the same. So now I write the zeros to the right of the 13. Well, how many did I say we had? We have 2. So in my answer, I'm going to have 2 zeros. So the product is 1,300, or 1,300. One way to also look at this is, well, if I said 13 times 1, if I'm going back to my original problem here, 13 times 10 squared up here, well, 13 times 1 is going to be 13. And then I look at my exponent here, and I see a 2. So that means I'm going to have 2 zeros afterward. So my final answer is going to be 1,300. Just one way to mentally look at this. All right, so example 3, find 40 times 7,000 mentally. Well, that can be a little scary, but if we break it down into pieces, it's much more manageable. So we're going to first write the basic multiplication fact. Well, what's the basic problem? I see a 4 times 7, right? So 4 times 7 is 28. Now I count the number of zeros in each factor. So in each part of the problem, so I see 1 0 in 40, and I see 1, 2, 3 zeros in 7,000. So total, I add 1 plus 3, I will have 4 zeros in my answer. Well, step 3, write the zeros to the right of the product from step 1. Well, if I had 28, remember our 28 that we had over here? So I'm going to bring that over here, and I have 28. And I'm going to have how many zeros? Well, I have 4, so I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros. So my product is going to be 280,000. Hopefully that catches the pattern that you're seeing. All right, so let's do one more here for guided practice, or a couple more here for guided practice. Find the product mentally. All right, well, I'm going to first look at my basic problem. And I see 8 times 1. Well, what is 8 times 1? Well, that's going to be 8, right? And then I count how many zeros I have, or my exponent, I'm sorry, not how many zeros. I see my exponent is 2. So that's how I mentally just look at this. But if we broke down actually what 10 squared is, well, 10 squared is 100, 10 times 10, right? 10 squared is 10 times 10, right? Well, the total number of zeros in 100, well, there are 2. So I'm going to have my basic problem. Again, we just were talking about that. 8 times 1 is 8. And then I have 2 zeros in my exponent here. So I'm going to have 800 as my answer. Let's look at our next one. And I see my basic problem. This is always where we start going to, is 14 times 2. Basic problem here is 14 times 2, and you get 28. Now I'm going to count my zeros, and I see I've got 1, 2, 3 zeros. So total number of zeros, 3. So I should have 3 zeros in my answer after that basic problem. So 28, right? That's our basic problem. And then I'm going to add my 3 zeros, 1, 2, 3. That's where these came from. And so my answer is 28,000. All right, so you go through, and I want you to practice these. Pause this video, and then do these, and then come back and check this. Pause now. All right, so hopefully you pause it, and now you're checking back. If I'm looking at our problem, you should have, for 13 times 1,000, you should have 13,000. For number 4, 37 times 10 squared, you should have 3,700. For 9,000 times 3, you should have 27,000. For 8 times 10 cubed, well, I'm going to look again. My basic problem, 8 times 1, I have 8, and I count my exponent here. I have 3, so I should end up with 8,000 as my answer. 21 times 10 to the first power. Well, again, I look at my basic problem, 21 times 1. I have 21. How many zeros do I have? Well, I look at my exponent. I have a 1, so I should have 1 0. And then 9 times 50, basic problem again. 9 times 5 is 45. I count how many zeros I have, and I have 450. Find the missing number. Let's do these real fast. So if I'm going to look at this, I'm going to say, well, what number times 1 would give me my 7 that I see here. Well, that should be 7. And then I look at my exponent here, 4, and I do have 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros. So 7 works. If I'm saying 3 times what gives me 12, I know it's going to be a 4, right? But my answer, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros. I only have 1, 2 in my problem.